Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 24th of August, and in today's video we're looking at the Russians crossing over the Vavt River, entering into the village of Filia, which is within Dnipro Oblast, is on the road as well to the town of Novopavlivka. But today is Ukraine's Independence Day, and it's been rather uneventful, so we will have enough time by the end of the upload to look at some foreign military sales to Ukraine and some aid packages announced by Norway, Germany, Canada, and most interestingly, the sale of 3,350 extended range attack munitions by the United States to European nations that will then send it to Ukraine. But let's zoom in on the frontline updates, and we will begin with this projection that occurred just to the west of the border between Dnipro and Donetsk over here. You can see that the Russians are pushing past Malivka, and my depiction of the situation is actually very safe, very conservative, because a lot of Russian sources and even some Ukrainians are alleging that the entirety of the village of Vorona has fallen into their hands, into their control. And I just haven't seen any backing up of this. I haven't seen enough from footage, because usually, the Russian units over here are really active when it comes to posting on Telegram, just footage of the course of the artillery preparation and storming the village, and they give a lot of specific information about which units are involved and how many houses are cleared out. That's generally been the modus operandi when it comes to announcing a capture of a village. We saw it with areas like Malivka, for example, and also Sichneve at a certain point. The Russians claimed that they took over Sichneve, and then we've received no follow-up, and a lot of Ukrainian sources rebuffed that in recent weeks. And so there's a lot of hesitancy about whether that's true or not. So for now, that's another area that's still a bit ambiguous. Some Russian sources claim that it's under their control, whereas others don't. And this is actually the case for a lot of villages over here in this border area, not just Verona and Sichneve, but also Sosnivka. So you have at least 3 villages that may or may not be within Russian control, which could actually radically change the analysis of where the front line is and what that means for the Ukrainians that are defending. Because think about it, Komishuvacha right now is certainly in a compromised position, but if it's actually true, the Russians have penetrated at a distance really, really deep in the north flank of the village. You could see it over here. Then it would further complicate the situation for those forces over there and for nearby troops that are defending in Ternove, Berezhove, any other accumulation of forces in tree lines located within this sort of semicircle cauldron area that you see over here. Because not only are they enduring direct pressure from the east or from the southeast, potentially, these are the main Russian vectors of attack, but there's also the possibility of then the pockets caving in from the north due to these Russian attack vectors continuing to develop unabated. So this is actually a serious concern, even if it hasn't unfolded already, because you can already see this is the direction in which it is headed. Because the Russian forces did, at the very least, capture 1.35 square kilometers of territory west of Malivka. And this is, of course, assuming that the Russians have not captured these villages now, which is not for a certain, it's not a certainty, I should say. But you have over here Sichneve, which is extremely isolated from other major Ukrainian nodes of resistance, and same would go for Vorona and Horoshi over here in Sosnivka. This is just a pattern that I noticed with a lot of villages over here, that they're small, so they're very easy to storm for a Russian assault detachment that sort of goes out on a limb to try to attack a particular location. The Ukrainians, their main garrison and main organizational point, I should say, is around here, Veliki Komikhailivka. And so it is a relatively large town, but it's on the northern edge of the river. And then the southern suburb is Arestopil. It's a bit smaller. And then from there, it's pretty much open. The entire Ukrainian holding and possession south of the river, the southern bank, is just completely open. Not many paved roads. So this is an underdeveloped area. And the villages that are present over here are small, as we said before. The troops placed over here are not necessarily the best. Their manpower situation is not sufficient, I believe, for defensive activities and holding out in extended pockets, when you're considering the fact that whenever you hold out in a pocket, you have to defend the flanks, and therefore the entire line becomes much more difficult to defend. You need more forces to defend the pocket than you do to defend a sort of contiguous front line, I should say. So certainly there are a lot of factors that go against the Ukrainians defending over here, which is why it would not be surprising if it hasn't already happened. The Russians can actually develop a vector of attack west of Malivka and running along this river valley, the Verona River Valley, in this particular location. And it's a very narrow river. It's actually not a factor when it comes to impeding the Russian progress. It's just a low-lying location, and the water is barely noticeable. So it just sort of leads into the next line of villages over here. So these are areas that are extremely compromised and can be exploited by the Russians. And I talked about this in yesterday's video, and I'll just continue talking about it consistently until, we see it manifest, because I can expect a situation wherein this area is seized due to those gaps and the lack of foresight to fortify these areas in a sufficient manner, and then from there, Vacha follows in the process because it would just be untenable for the Ukrainians to hold on over there with their northern flank collapsing, and then there would also be impetus for the Russians to pursue this northern flank and apply the pressure from the north towards all these other villages that are running along the second line of defense in Zaporizhzhia, the one that we talked about in yesterday's video, because what I was saying is that there are two lines of defense that are heavily recognized in Zaporizhzhia, in addition to even further back on the rear, there are a couple of other lines that aren't necessarily mapped over here. But at its furthest extent, this line, when it's in Dnipro Oblast, is 24 kilometers away from the line of contact. If we're looking at the closest point, it's about 10 kilometers. So you're looking at a span of 10 to 24 kilometers. So it is supposed to be one that holds out against a Russian infiltration into this sort of protruding parts of Zaporizhzhia. So it would be this region over here, this rectangular shaped part of Zaporizhzhia, which includes the city of Zaporizhzhia, obviously, and a lot of open areas, this entire network of highways and then paved roads, and then largely just open fields and small towns in the eastern part of Zaporizhzhia. So that's a very rural section of the oblast, and it's also an area that is certainly ripe for the picking as a result. But again, that's just getting ahead of ourselves. Looking at what's most pertinent for today, it would be in relation to the southern bank of the Vavcha River. If you guys don't see it on the map, the river itself runs along this course over here. So all the open fields and the villages that are to the south of it are now under threat of capture by the Russian side. And then the Russian attention could get hooked southwards to try to overrun and just nullify any sort of potential effects that the Ukrainians could have had by utilizing the trench lines, anti-tank ditches, the dragon's teeth, the barbed wire for defensive purposes in lieu of some sort of Russian frontal assault at some point. Now, due to this maneuver coming in from the east and northeast to a certain degree, it's going to be much more difficult for that to ever have the same sort of utility that it was sort of imagined to have when it was planned out that way. But let's look at what we do know for sure. There's been an update from the Iskra direction, or if you prefer the Ukrainian name for it, Andrivka Klevtsove. So apparently the Ukrainians have been unable to retain control over Tolstoy, so now it's back in the gray zone. And again, the Ukrainians, for the same reason the Russians lost control over these three villages, now the Ukrainians are going to lose control over some of them because simply they're overextended. The Ukrainians have very strong organization points and logistics in Havrilivka and Ivanivka. And also, they are able to accumulate forces in the forests west of the Vavcha River, but then crossing over and retaining control over villages on the eastern bank, and then expanding control even further eastwards. And you could see it over here at a distance of like 7 kilometers or 8 kilometers, and then retaining control over those fort positions. It becomes extremely difficult. In broad daylight, the Russian forces are able to just squeeze the Ukrainians out of their supply points via various aerial means, and then it becomes very difficult to move back and forth because they're exposed to Russian aerial reconnaissance, and it's difficult to hold out with supplies. So Tolstoy was abandoned for that reason. The Ukrainians are opting to resist in the tree lines a bit to the west, where they may have a bit of concealment and therefore just reduce the amount of casualties and reduce the possibility of getting isolated. Because while Tolstoy was taken over, the Russians never left Novopavlivka, so there's always the threat of an attack coming in from the northern flank in conjunction with one coming from the south in Podubny, where the Russians do still have a very strong presence. So Tolstoy was always going to be in that sort of precarious situation. And then in Zeleny Hive, the Ukrainians still control it, but the Russians do have a springboard to attack towards it through Novopavlivka, as we said. Now, Some Ukrainian sources claim that the northeastern parts of the town is still in a gray zone with some level of Russian footprint, which would be weird because how is that possible if the Ukrainians are in control of Zeleny High? It would sort of imply that there's this narrow corridor that allows the Russian soldiers to cross through open areas and then arrive at this northeastern part of the village. So yes, what appears to be happening, what appears to be the case, is that the front line is not necessarily as solid as I depict it to be. And the problem is, I don't want to just leave everything as open over here because I want to give you guys an idea of the forward positions for either side. But that should not be mistaken with clear-cut control that can be, said is confidently within one side's dominion 24/7. That's not what I want people to think when they see the map. I just want people to know that either side has like a relatively noticeable footprint on the lines, that whether they're red or blue over here. But it's not always going to be a proper methodology because it does appear as if a lot of these fields aren't necessarily under strong Ukrainian control, but that the Ukrainians and the Russians do the same thing. They did the same thing in this exact sector, actually, and we'll look at that in Filia. But the Ukrainians, in this particular case, with the 5th Heavy Mechanized Brigade and the 37th Marine Brigade, and then also GR forces, and a whole host of other units that you see on the map over here, including the 214th Assault Battalion that is also involved in the Zeleny High storming and Tolstoy storming. What I'm trying to say is that they sent in small squads. They're not doing so in any large accumulation, and that's how they're able to act pretty much in a mobile manner and penetrate deeply in a fast amount of time, and then enter into certain areas that may have previously been in a gray zone or Russian hands, and then the map changes accordingly, but they don't always stay there. Sometimes they move out after the videos are filmed. The Russians do the same thing. It becomes sort of a war of flags, and so we have to be wary of that, and that's one of the downsides of only relying on geolocations when it comes to videos being released and then using that as the barometer for which side controls which particular piece of land or field or tree line or such. So just that's my warning about their way of interpreting pieces of information. But over here in Filia, you can see that manifest because, again, the video here shows that there was Russian artillery preparation via a large caliber barrel artillery and Grad MLRS shelling. And so they just struck a wide variety of targets in Filia. In Filia, it's pretty small. So when you have that level of barrage all at once, it does lead to a lot of damage across the board for whatever garrison is defending there. And then there were also FPV strikes and airstrikes on armored vehicles and on Ukrainian troop accumulations. So then what we saw is at least one Russian soldier was filmed on camera. He swam across the river. And so look at the river. It's really narrow. Like anyone could do this, I believe. Anyone that knows how to swim will be able to cross this area. It's only about 30 meters. So, not bad. So they crossed over and it appears as if they had like this wood plank that was attached to them or something of the sorts ahead of them as they were swimming, and they were largely submerged, but you could still see some of their head. And they cross over, and this is the thing. A lot of these forces, once they cross over, they have the afforded advantage of concealing themselves in these tree lines. The Ukrainians did the same exact thing, and they are doing so to a large degree with this forested chunk of territory that's a bit north of the Vovcha River. You can see it over here. This is an area where a lot of Ukraine's forward nodes try to operate. I don't know if they have dugouts over here, but they certainly do send forces to this area to compensate for the fact that there aren't many villages over here. Because Filia is the only village in the direction of Novopavlivka. There are literally no other ones south of it or east of it at this point. In the northeast, you have Moravka, and that's the one area where you do have a couple of Ukrainian villages. But to the south, you have just largely open fields, and then the defensive fortifications like this horizontal anti-tank ditch, and then the Dragon's Teeth over here to the east, and then directly to the east of the town. This is where you have some of these lines that are not exactly unified. That's another issue. They're not unified, so it's easy to, in piecemeal fashion, take them over and then assault the perimeter itself, and which is well defended. Admittedly, the perimeter itself is well defended, but everything approaching it isn't. So from the south over here to Filia, this is one of Ukraine's most important defensive strong points because it's being used as an area where forces can then get dispersed to the river bank, the area north of the river, for instance. And they could get dispersed to this forested area. They can get dispersed to the hedgerows that are running along open fields, or the tree lines that sort of chug along the Solona River, which you see over here. A lot of that has been now taken over by the Russian side due to this capture of 3.4 square kilometers of territory. And you look at the distance, it's about, what is that, 2.3 kilometers northwards. So the Russians have at least taken over some of Filia. I don't know about the northern chunk, but over here, based on the geolocation from August 24th, the Russians swam across the river and they raised their flag. Like I said, flag raising. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be permanently in control of it, but it does mean that at this point, the Russian side has been able to create a new standard where they can cross over the river, that the actual natural barrier isn't enough to stop Russian offensive activity in this direction. They're going to be able to cross over the obstacle and then from there pave this path along a area that's largely consisting of open fields, but you do have some routes over here, local routes, maybe a gravel road that leads directly into Filia. And there's a corridor that can be used, and this can be repeated even if it doesn't succeed the first time, to take over Filia. And then from there, you do have a paved road. This one is actually paved, and it leads directly to the town of Novopavlivka, and is also one that directly bisects the defense lines that are supposed to engulf the entirety of the town. So this is an important vector. It's important for the Russians to anchor there and then use that as a base through which to expand towards Novopavlivka eventually, because that's what Dakhny, that was the utility of Dakhny, essentially. The fact that they were able to have this bridgehead across the river, but the efforts of Ukraine's over here 35th Marine Brigade have prevented the Russians from further blossoming out. So they've just contained the Russian attack and ensured that it sort of fizzles out within Dakhny, which is another village under Russian control in Dnipro Oblast. And so for now, they've not really been able to push the Ukrainians out of any nearby dugouts or forested areas, which are still very present over here in this area just directly north of the Vavtra River. So those are areas that are of Russian interest right now, trying to push Ukrainians out of them, because that will create the necessary groundwork and lay the framework for an attack eventually on Novopavlivka from the southern direction. So yeah, very interesting course of clashes over here, there, course of battles. Regarding the Klemenbeek Reservoir, I know a lot of people in the comments are saying that Kateryivka and even potentially Klemenbeek have fallen. And if you're looking at DivGen's map, for instance, then that's what you'll see. And, you know, I just never take what they say by themselves, I would say. Like, if that's the only source that's reporting on it and changing the map, then I'm not going to use that on its own to change the map. But if there are numerous reports coming out, and then DivGen also comes out with information saying that there's some sort of change to the line of contact, then I'm inclined to also use that in my calculation of whether that's actually the case or not. And a lot of it has to do with like a standard of accuracy. So I'm not sure. It is certainly possible, and it's actually more likely than not that the Russians are inside of Kateryivka. I don't know if it's solidified control yet, but at this point, it seems rather likely, because the Ukrainians, for the most part, have withdrawn to Klemenbeek. That's indisputable by now. They are consolidating around there. And we do have a geolocation that we talked about before of the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment clearing out Ukrainian strongholds to the east. So we know they have at least a presence over here, so it would not be too far-fetched for them to have a presence about a kilometer to the northwest. And it is true, according to Ukrainian sources, that there was an attempt last night to infiltrate into the town, but I've not seen any corroboration of actual entry or capture, not even that. And so Kateryivka appears to be the more realistic target as of now, because the Ukrainians are abandoning it and trying to consolidate along this one narrow corridor and concentrating all of their forces over there. Because again, we talked about this yesterday. They do have a large troop concentration over here that cannot be disputed. We looked at the orders of battle. There are lots of National Guard, units from the Azov Corps, for instance, unit from the National Police force. You have a lot of separate battalions. You have mechanized forces even. So you have this whole confluence of forces all being deployed to various capacities to this area over here. And they also were defending in Kateryivka as of mid-August, and they defended against a major assault from the 68th Tank Regiment in early August. But at this point, it simply became untenable. It's at risk of being assaulted from the east now due to the recent Russian advances. But what this also means is that if the Ukrainians truly are in control of Kalmabik to its fullest extent, as I believe they are at this point, then they're going to be defending a very narrow corridor, and that will not have long-term viability. The longer it goes on, the more casualties are incurred in the process, especially given the fact that there are, a pretty significant amount of forces actually deployed to the reservoir at this point. And that would include in the corridor areas around Klemenbeek or to the east of Yablonivka, and then also the ones defending this horizontal trench line within the reservoir pocket itself, which is even more dangerous because of how open it is and how far away it is from the supply lines. So again, another area to keep in mind, because just based on the momentum and the underlying dynamics of the front line, it's simply not sustainable. A couple of updates from the Pokrovsk sector, and again, this is all unverified, which is why I've not changed the map. But Siersky, he said, for instance, that the Ukrainians recaptured 3 villages today, one of them being Volodymyrivka, but that was never under Russian control. On my map and my depiction of it, the Ukrainians were always in full control of this village, and there was never any indication from either source that there had been a faltering of the line over here. We know that Pankivka fell to Russian hands, and that recently the Russians have attacked the eastern flank of Shakhove with the intention of eventually squeezing the Ukrainians out of Volodymyrivka. But that's different than actually asserting that the Russians had a presence over here. So that's a non-starter because it was always under their control. They also claim that Zeleny High is under their control, which is true. And then they also mention Mykolaievka as a village taken over. And this is something that I just can't verify, because the problem is Mykolaievka is like a rather large village. And so it's possible, and it's actually true when you look at the map, that the Ukrainians took over some of it. But asserting that all of it was taken back would imply that they took all of this area over here that you see. I'm highlighting 0.8 square kilometers of territory, including a lot of residential areas that are directly to the east of Novoekonomichny, and would sort of imply the Russians also crossed through Novoekonomichny to enter into these areas, because it would be unrealistic of the Ukrainians to have a maneuver wherein they cross over the river and then they sort of circumvent everything and take over all these houses individually. It would just be too overextended to do such a thing within a populated area. And so, again, that's something that I'm doubtful of, but the assertion that they would have partial presence over here is not unrealistic at all, because they already have been geolocated in an area to the northeast of Mykolaievka. And some Ukrainian sources go as far as to say that the Russians were pushed out of Mirny and that the Ukrainians have the front line looking something like this, where they are trying to enter into the houses in Mirny. But again, something that's not been corroborated by geolocated proof, and Russian sources don't say that themselves at this point. For the most part, I know we said Romanov said something of the sort, but he was also being very ambiguous, and he didn't say anything about like permanent Ukrainian control. So that's why I've not changed the map over here, because again, it's just too much ambiguity, and that's going to be one of the downsides of not always having geolocations on demand. One other area where we've seen a lot of fighting recently is around Dorozhny, Ivanivka, and Nikhanorivka. This is where some of the higher intensity fighting on a daily basis is shifted towards. You have the Azov Brigade, the 12th National Guard Brigade, as they're called, operating in conjunction with the 14th National Guard Brigade and the Da Vinci Wolves battalion, or regiment, sorry. I know they're over here. I don't know why I can't find them now. Yeah, over here, Assault Regiment. So they are working in tandem to clear out the gray zone for around Ruvilne and around Ivanivka, and just continuing to push the Kocherov Yar salient further and further eastwards by basically ensuring that no DRGs have a presence or an ability to even approach Novopavlivka or its outskirts. So that's been their focus over the past 2 to 3 days. And in the process, they've been engaging in clashes in Novoshachove with the Russians, or in Nikhanorivka, which is under full Russian control. So that's a bit of a rundown on what's going on over there, but not much else to really, at least when I'm recording this. Maybe something will come out while I'm recording that I don't see, and I don't have control over that, unfortunately. But there's one other unconfirmed report, and I've seen this circulating on all the Ukrainian channels. They claim that they've been able to retake the village, and you can see it over here. It's in an area to the northwest of the Zherbets River. I just want to open it up over here. It's Novomikhailivka. So they claim to have retaken it. And, it's certainly possible, because it is in an area that's a bit more peripheral to Russia's objectives. Hopefully it loads now. yeah, and you could see how it's a pretty small settlement. It includes a massive forested area, which would be positive for the Ukrainians if they want to infiltrate into the village, because all they would have to do is push from the border where they do have a presence, especially the 4th Battalion of the Presidential Brigade, and then there are a couple of other nearby units, like one battalion from Rapid Reaction Brigade, 518th Battalion of the 1st Special Purpose Brigade, and yeah, list goes on. There are a couple of these smaller, tight-knit units that are deployed over here, so they can disperse across the border and then get into these forested areas, and then from there push along the one and only road that crosses this town and take over the individual houses. So that's an area where it's possible, but the capture of Novopavlivka and even nearby areas on its own would not do enough to change the course of the fighting in Liman if that's the intention. If it's not the intention, then really it doesn't have much of a broader significance, because right now the Russian focus, for the most part, isn't necessarily on directly closing in on the chain of villages from Kopanki to Olhivka, although that's something that certainly would be beneficial to the Russians. It's more so on developing the conditions necessary from the east and from the northwest to close in on Liman. And during that process, of course, the Zherbets bridgehead is being used as a mechanism to assert control and take over certain heights that overlook the town of Liman, and also get control over the logistics that run into it. But Novopavlivka is on the northern end of that bridgehead and doesn't serve that same sort of level of utility unless you're talking about then a broader plan to reach Nova. And I just haven't seen any level of indication of that, either through just open source reporting or Ukrainian troop deployments that are very scarce and scant in this particular area. So that's it when it comes to the frontline updates. Again, a lot of rumors, which is why I've not changed the map to reflect it. I'm just telling you guys so you know. But when it comes to the aid packages to Ukraine, first of all, what's being reported by the Wall Street Journal is that the Trump administration approved the sale of 3,350 of the extended range attack munitions. These are air launched missiles, so they will be sent, according to them, within 6 weeks. And that means, if that ends up being the case, that we'll see them being sent by mid-October. And again, this is a big question mark. Will it actually be that soon? And will the full breadth of the missiles that are being purported to have already actually been produced, because you would expect that they'd be produced by now, are there actually 3,000 plus that have been produced? That's another question. So the United States has worked on these two specific prototypes of the ERAMs, as I call them. And one of them is called Co-Aspire, and the other one's called Rusty Dagger. So they're 3D printed, meaning that it basically reduced the cost by a lot, from what could have been $1 million to $300,000 per missile. And so that's a good way to just increase the scalability of the missile, the fact that it is 3D printed. And it is GPS guided, which is going to be an issue because it's obviously going to be spoofed and jammed by the Russian side. There's going to be a massive disparity between what's claimed as the CEP, because you read the reporting on the details of ERAMs, and it's claimed that they have a 10-meter CEP, but you just don't see that in reality in Ukraine because of all the jamming. It could be well over 100 meters in reality due to that intense jamming. So it's going to have to go through this phase of adapting to those concerns and finding ways to just sort of reduce the effects of such jamming. So that's going to play a role in affecting the accuracy, but even still, 100 meters isn't the end of the world. But to be fair, the yield isn't that large, it's 250 kilograms. And so the range is also within around 400 kilometers. So you're looking at a 250 kg warhead and then 400 kilometer range, meaning that it could target anywhere within Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine, could target sections, or I believe, it could target all of Crimea, depending on where, obviously, it's going to be launched from by the Ukrainian Air Force. And it could also target large chunks of Russian territory, whether you're looking at areas in Rostov, whether you're looking at areas that are targeted more frequently by the Ukrainian Air Force in Kursk, Bryansk, etc., Belgorod, Voronezh. But at the same time, the Wall Street Journal has also been running this article that the United States is restricting Ukraine's ability, and has been throughout the entirety of the Trump administration, from using their American-produced and American-subsidized weapon systems to target Russian sort of facilities within Russian-controlled territory. So not the Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine, but actually Russia proper. So that's a part of this concerted media campaign and media efforts, which is also being fed through people, operatives within the Trump administration to sort of get the word out there that now there's going to be pressure exerted on Russia through the potential and then perhaps the implementation of approval for Ukraine to use those missiles in Russian territory within Russia proper. So that's being used as a pressure mechanism, that the potential for that to be the case at some point in the future. That's why it's being highlighted now. And that's also a part of why the ERMs are being sent in, because if the United States ever changes its policy, then those certainly are going to be useful to target large swaths of Russian territory in the way that's already been being done with Ukrainian native drones or any other domestically produced system. So certainly interesting, but that's not the only thing that the Ukrainians are going to receive. They are also going to receive at some point. This is again an issue. What are the timetables? It's always easy to state something as a press release, but then the actual implementation takes way longer. So Norway and Germany, they're going to pay for 2 Patriot air defense systems, and they are stationed in Germany right now. So they're going to also purchase the interceptors for them. And this was announced by Norway's Ministry of Defense. So Norway specifically, they're working on providing the Ukrainians with air defense radars as well. So Germany specifically, they're securing a contract, and that will allow them to basically secure the delivery of TRML for the air defense radars to Ukraine, and also short-range air defense Typhoon 2 air defense radars. And that comes from the Kongsberg company. So that's where this agreement is being secured from. And Norway themselves, on their part, they sent the Typhoon 1 to the Ukrainians last year. They sent 10 of them last year. And the goal with the Typhoon 2, which is like an improved version of the previous radar, is to just cover the gap, the detection gap between the short to medium range systems. That's the objective with all this. And so the entire package by Norway is around $665 million. I don't know how much the Germans are spending on it. It wasn't publicly announced. And then you have the deal that Canada announced that they're going to be sending another $2 billion in aid to Ukraine. So again, just not anything too significant. Like the Patriot systems are significant actually. So I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about like the daily trickle of aid to Ukraine through those like $1 billion, $2 billion packages from nations like the United Kingdom or Canada. So the Canadian one is just going to be about filling the backlog whenever it's necessary. So just for instance, securing additional ammunition for artillery, or perhaps paying for air defense interceptors, paying for like small arms ammo, medical kits, things of the sorts. That's largely what the aid package is going to be about. And then the most interesting part, in my opinion, is going to be the drone collaboration between Ukraine and Canada. They're going to fund, I think, to the tune of like 300 million, like programs for drone production and electronic warfare. So just that's something that's being mentioned as well. Now, to finish off, just as a recap, before this entire sale process was announced in relation to the ERAMs, before that point, the United States had sent during the Trump administration $300 million worth of equipment to the Ukrainians via the Presidential Drawdown Authority. So there's still a couple billion left in that coffer. There's also about $9 million that was spent within the USAI. So that's the Security Initiative, which is a different program. So again, very small amount, very trivial amount. And then $11.81 billion in foreign military sales, which will continue to comprise the vast majority of the aid that ends up coming to Ukraine. This is going to be the new way in which it happens. And we've been talking about this for a while, that this is going to, regardless of what happens with like the course of negotiations, the United States is continuing to fund Ukraine, not directly in all cases, but in many cases through sales to European countries that then immediately send it off to the Ukrainians, or perhaps the European nations send their own systems to the Ukrainians, and then the United States pays for new ones sent to the European countries. In effect, it doesn't matter because it's fungible. And so then the Ukrainians either way benefit from whatever aid sent to the United States via the United States. But the way in which is different from Biden would be the fact that now the United States is requiring a level of payment that wasn't as emphasized beforehand. But when it comes to the actual policy of sending aid and such, despite the protests of the Albert Colbys of the world, that's not changing. There's no indication of that changing, especially now. What I would keep an eye out though for is whatever happens with the United States' policy of long range strikes or using American systems like ERAMs or whatever new ones the United States will decide to send in the future to the Ukrainians, whether they'll end up approving them for striking Russian territory, like across the border in Belgorod or Voronezh, for instance. But certainly, up until then, they'll be used to strike Russian-controlled territory and also Crimea. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.